Welcome back. Turning now to new developments in the Trump administration's plans for Venezuela now that Nicolas Maduro is in U.S. custody, with the president now signaling the U.S. could be involved in that country for years to come, after telling me earlier this week in an exclusive phone interview that he is the top person in charge of Venezuela. The president gave a wide-ranging interview to the New York Times where he was asked how long the U.S. would be running Venezuela. Would it be 3 months, 6 months, a year, longer? The president replying, I would say much longer. It comes as lawmakers, including some in the president's own party, looked to rein in the president's authorities. Today, 5 Senate Republicans joined all 47 Democrats to advance a resolution to block the president from using military force within or against Venezuela unless he gets approval from Congress. President Trump lashing out against those Republicans by name on social media, saying they should, quote, never be elected again. Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who is in Colombia for us. So, Gabe, what do you make of the latest comments by President Trump that the U.S. could be in charge of Venezuela for years? What's the reaction in the region been?
Well, certainly, Kristen, this is the administration really ramping up its efforts to control Venezuela's oil. Not a huge surprise. The president hinted at this several days ago when he said that this could take some time, reiterating now that this will not be a short-term plan. As you said, when he was asked whether it be 3 months, a year, him saying much longer. So this could stretch on. White House officials have been repeating that this is something that will advance the national security interests of the United States, and certainly the infrastructure, the oil infrastructure in the country. Not a huge surprise, but certainly met with some concern around the region. Although here in Colombia, there does seem to be a sort of thaw in relations after some harsh words were exchanged between President Trump and Colombian President Petro earlier this week, Kristen.
Well, Gabe, let me follow up with you about that, because the two leaders did speak. What do we know of what came out of that call?
It is an incredibly fascinating call, Kristen, and pretty remarkable. Really a sharp turnabout from President Trump. And just moments ago, I just spoke with the defense minister here in Bogota, and he said that it was a critical call. He did say that there seemed to be a thaw in relations. And when I asked him what changed between when President Trump on Sunday aboard Air Force One called Petro a, quote, sick man, and then just 2 days later, Petro called Trump, he said he had a senile brain. I asked him, what changed? And the defense minister said what changed in his view was that President Trump got some correct information, that he had been fed misinformation by his advisors before. And so he was grateful that the president seemed to have a different perspective on this. He was very glad to hear and to read in that post by President Trump that Trump said that he was honored by the phone call, that he had invited Petro to the White House, and that the president appreciated his tone. And so the defense minister told me that plans are in the works for Colombian officials, including himself, to travel to Washington in the near future to speak with President Trump. A dramatic shift from what we heard earlier in the week, Kristen.
Certainly is a dramatic turn of events. Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for all of your phenomenal reporting from Bogota, Colombia. We really appreciate it. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York. He's also the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
So I want to start with the briefing that you attended yesterday about the United States actions in Venezuela. President Trump telling the New York Times the United States could be in charge of Venezuela for years. Is that consistent with what briefers told you?
No, it's not. But, you go back with the president, because I've been used to now going in with briefers, and what they say turns out not to be accurate. What the president says is what they do, and then they try to clean up for the president. But ultimately, as we were told previously, we would not go into Venezuela. We're in Venezuela.
Well, I want to get your take on the next steps that have been discussed. Apparently, Secretary Rubio announcing a 3-step plan. It includes stabilization, recovery to ensure access to Venezuela's markets, and reconciliation to rebuild the civil society there. What do you make of that plan? Were you given enough details about it?
I didn't hear a plan at all, to be quite frank with you. Also, let me just tell you, have you heard democracy come out of the president's mouth one time. Think about where we were and what the president has talked about. First, it was all about drugs. Now we're really not hearing much about drugs. Then it was about regime change. Now they took away Maduro, which is not a bad, Maduro is not a good guy at all. He stole an election in that regards and been a terrible human rights abuser. But then only subsequent to that, he's only talked about oil and what he's going to do with the oil and how he's going to control the oil. Before he invaded Venezuela, he talked to oilmen. Immediately thereafter, he talked to oilmen. And the reason why he's saying that we're going to be there for years is because, as he said, he believes, that's American oil. He doesn't care about democracy, what follows, or the people of Venezuela. That's why still, he took away TPS for many Venezuelans, and it looks like he may be pushing, we got a whole bunch of individuals throughout America, but especially in Florida. They are asking what's going to happen with our state, over close to 600,000 of them. He doesn't care about the people. He doesn't care about anything, apparently, based upon his own statements, other than oil.
Congressman, let me follow up with you on that point. You clearly disagree with the public statements that we've heard from President Trump, but have you ruled out the possibility that Maduro's ouster could lead to democracy in Venezuela? Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, look, the people, I've had a long-term relationship with the people of Venezuela. Fact of the matter is, you want to know, the truth is about, I'm probably the only member of Congress that have had conversations directly with Maduro from way back 20 years ago, where he's, and subsequent thereto, the lies that he's had to me. But the people of Venezuela believe in democracy, and that's what they've been asking for. They go out and they vote. I have witnessed elections in Venezuela where people, opposition and chavistas, were lined up for hours waiting for the opportunity to vote. Just recently, in 2024, with Maduro as a dictator there, the Venezuelan people came out to vote in numbers, and the opposition won the election. That's the election that was stolen by Maduro. So Maduro was able to do something that Donald Trump wasn't able to do. He stole the election in Venezuela. Trump was trying to steal the one here in the United States. Fortunately, our institutions prevented that from happening. But the Venezuelan people believe in democracy. That's what they want. They want their own country, and they want their voices heard. And if you give them the opportunity to vote, there had been an election. And Mr. Gonzalez was elected president in 2004. That's what they want. They don't want the United States to control their oil, their resources, or tell them what to do. They know that they want the opportunity to have free and fair elections.
But and I hear what you're saying, that they want that. Do you think it is a possibility now, given that Maduro is no longer there?
I think it's a possibility, because the possibility of having an election was there when Maduro was there. The problem was Maduro did not acknowledge the results of the election. It was very similar to Donald Trump not acknowledging the results of the election here in America. There was an election that was free, that was fair, and that Maduro lost. Just like here, there was an election here that was free, that was fair, that Trump lost. Trump contended that the numbers, and if he had the opportunity to do what Maduro had in Venezuela, he would have done it here. The people, so yes, there have been free and fair elections. It's just that those election results were not recognized by Maduro. He disregarded them.
Let me ask you, because the government of Venezuela, the interim government, announcing today that it would, in fact, release a large number of political prisoners. Do you think that would have happened without this pressure campaign by President Trump and the Trump administration?
I think it would have happened without Maduro. I think that if, in fact, the election had been where the people of Venezuela came out to vote in 2024, it would have happened then. I think the election before that with Maduro, again, playing around with elections, it would have happened then. We would have had a good relationship in that regards, and working as we've had in the past, even with drugs, as far as sharing information, etc. So there's no question in my mind that it is that Maduro was a problem there. But we do have rules, we have regulations that we need to take place. We have human rights to say that you're going to take the oil from Venezuela and put it to an offshore account, and you, the President of the United States, going to decide who he's going to sell it to and who gets it. That's colonialism. That's not what the people of Venezuela wants. That is not the way to go about this. This is not the right and correct thing, and the people of Venezuela doesn't want it, and by God, I don't believe the people of the United States of America wants that either.
Let me ask you about the big story here domestically, the shooting of a 37-year-old mom by an ICE officer, the administration saying it was self-defense. Some of your Democratic colleagues are now suggesting using the appropriations process to try to rein in the Department of Homeland Security. Would you support that?
Yeah, look, what's happening on the streets by ICE. Here's individuals walking around in a mask, and if I look at what took place, you know, my eyes were not lying to me. There's more that I think that we need to see and know. But what my eyes saw on that video, it did not look, it looked like that the individual officer who shot that lady did not have to do it. It looked like a egregious act of which there need to be a complete and thorough investigation, and not the kind of situation where I'm hearing the Homeland Security Secretary saying, oh, it was the victim's fault here. There should be a complete and independent investigation. I would hope, you know, I know they want to try to prevent the Attorney General from Minnesota or others that would be on the ground to do that. Again, why would they not want that? Is because they have made a judgment themselves, but there should be a complete and thorough investigation as to what took place. But looking at that tape, it did not look at me, looked like to me, as well as others that I've talked to, including law enforcement officers. And I know for myself, this is not a case that I would have just said it's okay for this officer to do as a former prosecutor.
All right, Congressman Meeks, really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.